oral history collections of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and for the project, which is the FIT itself, its founding and its development. This interview is with founding Dean Rosalind Snyder. The date is November 1st, 1984. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. Dean Snyder, before we get into your life after you had joined FIT, would you be good enough to tell us about the origins of your own interest in the academic world, where you were born and when you were born, and how your own interests developed?
Do I just talk?
Mm-hmm.
I always wanted to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. This was my aim. And I really began teaching in the Board of Education for the City of New York in the elementary school. I then took the next step to go to the junior high school. And
But could we go back before that to when you were a child? Where were you born and when?
I was born in Brooklyn,
Mm-hmm.
New York, and in April 1st, 1905.
Mm-hmm.
I had my education in the public schools of New York City, and I really, as I said, always wished to be a teacher.
In other words, your earliest recollection of your answer, if somebody said to you what you want to do when you grow up or what you want to be, might have been, I want to be a teacher.
My mother told me that as I played school, and
Mm-hmm.
I believed her, and I think she was right.
Yes.
Because I have really enjoyed this profession. And as I worked, I decided that I would like to go into the high school, and I took the examination to become a teacher of English in the high school.
Uh-huh. Did you go to college or a normal school?
First I went to normal school,
Mm-hmm.
and then I continued and got my bachelor's and master's from New York University.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really did start to teach when I was only 18 years old. And
You by then had finished your academic...
I had finished the normal school,
Mm-hmm.
and began to teach at the age of 18 in 1923.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to the high school in 1937, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I accepted an appointment in the Central High School of Needle Trades because I became interested in the program of vocational education, and they then were expanding it to include academic subjects, so it would not be, these vocational schools would not only be trade schools, but they also would balance it with academic work. And this rather intrigued me, this area. So I joined the Central High School of Needle Trades.
Was this the first high school that you
Yes.
were with? Yes.
And as I was there, I was one of the first permanent appointments there. As I said, the division was beginning and expanding, and I later became chairman of the academic department of the high school. When Dr. Ritter called me into his office...
Was he then the principal?
Yes,
of
he
high
was the
school?
principal of the high school. And Dr. Ritter called me into his office one day in 1944, the beginning of the year, and he asked me whether I would be willing to be his assistant in initiating a post-secondary institute for the fashion industry. And I said, who, me? I don't know anything about the industry. I've never worked in the industry. I've always been going to school or teaching, and I really know nothing about it. And he said, I don't need you to know anything about it. I know, our committee of industry knows, what we want is a person who is sold on academic education and will see that this school has a broad base, that it is not just a trade school, that this training will lead people to become the executives and the leaders in the community, and we'll have a wide viewpoint.
Just so that we don't have any confusion here, your married name is Ritter, but that has nothing to do with Dr. Ritter, I suppose.
Nothing. I did get married while I was at the college, and as I said to Dr. Ritter, I was always lucky with the Ritters, and I decided to choose a Ritter. However, they were not related.
In what year were you married?
I was married in 1940.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I said, I kept my maiden name to avoid the confusion, but I was ahead of my time, and unfortunately, all my records at the board had to remain, had to be changed to Ritter. So it did cause a little confusion now and again, but therefore I really used Rosalind Snyder, but officially I would use Rosalind Snyder Ritter when I had to sign an official government documents.
Yes.
But I see women have come into their own now, ahead of my own time.
Yes, indeed.
For the-
You said, did you say earlier, when we were talking before the interview started, that you had been at a meeting at which the founders of the school?
Well,
really-
when Dr. Ritter invited me to become his assistant in the founding of this school, I was invited with him to a meeting at Mr. Half's office, which was
That's Mr. Morris Half.
Mr. Morris Half's office, at which a committee of the Educational Foundation were meeting. Now, the Educational Foundation had just become incorporated. Now, the thing that started them to ask for an incorporation in the Board of Regents was that the New York State had just passed a post-war education plan. And this plan was really to meet the educational needs of the returning veterans. And they were setting up various institutes over the state for automobile industry and plumbing and electrical and whatnot. But the apparel industry had not been mentioned. And the apparel industry said, what's wrong with us? We need an institute. But so they decided to ask the Board of Regents to incorporate them as an educational foundation for the apparel industry. And they wished then to arrange a contract with the Board of Education so they could start their institute.
Do you remember who was involved in this preliminary planning?
Yes, there were the main people that were involved was Max Meyer, who was the chairman of the group, and he was really a very influential.
Was he M-E-Y-E-R?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Morris W. Haft, who was the vice chairman, Samuel Deach, who was very active. The union also.
Excuse me, the first three people were all coat manufacturers.
Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they succeeded in getting the cooperation of the union, who was very cooperative. And we had Julius Hoffman and Isidore Nagler, who represented the union. They had a councilman, Fred Cooper was the lawyer that they had, who helped arrange the contracts and negotiations with the educators. And of course Mortimer C. Ritter, who was the principal of the high school. That was the major group. Now, this committee succeeded in getting other members of the foundation. Now, I don't remember all of the names of the first foundation, but I'm sure they must be on file for the first meetings. This foundation then negotiated with the Board of Education. Now, I think it's interesting to note, why did this foundation choose the Central High School of Needle Trades? Well, in 1937, the Central High School of Needle Trades had introduced what they called a postgraduate course in fashion design. And they were getting graduates of the academic high schools who were interested in design. Although design was taught in some other schools, it was generally, shall I say, directed to the couturier industry. And the mass production industry felt itself left out. They, for instance, wanted more pattern making and understanding of patterns and sizing than was available. And of course the draping and the art. And these were the techniques, they felt, that had to be emphasized. And they felt the present programs, as I said, were more for the individual designers, which were then very popular. So they did promote this postgraduate course in the Central High School of Needle Trades. And this had been running since 1937. And it
The
was
Central High School
of Needle Trades gave this postgraduate course.
How long had the Central Needle Trade School been in existence approximately, and who were their students?
The Central High School of Needle Trades, I don't know the date, but I imagine they were right there with the beginning of the vocational education, which I think was about, I gather it must have been in the 20s, the whole idea of vocational education.
Right. And what kind of students did the Central High School of Needle Trades have?
Well, at that time, we were having, the students were, generally speaking, the original students really, it was definitely a trade training, and it was to get people, it was mainly in the skills to get them. In other words, the immigration had fallen off. Most of the industry had been fed by immigrants, but immigration had practically stopped. And there was no longer the opportunity to get into the industry and have this big apprenticeship system. And this was the method by which a person could go in and learn a trade and get a job. So we had mainly the students, I would say, as a group, came from people who understood the apparel industry and wished to enter the apparel industry. And some of them had contacts or knew people in it. And that was the group. It was definitely to get jobs. However, our life was changing. Young people and their parents were getting more and more anxious that there should be, shall I say, recognition on a college level. And the fact that one was going into a trade didn't mean that you were not academically minded. There were other levels for you to go. And the people who were going to the colleges that were available were redirected away from the industry. For instance, if I went to a college and said I wanted to be a fashion designer, 9 times out of 10 I would end up in illustration rather than in fashion. The industry itself felt its own people that wanted to come up in the industry. If they went into engineering, it was adapted to the heavy industries. And the apparel industry was left with this no place for them to get, shall I say, academic recognition for their industry.
Or indeed training in their skills, which no longer were coming into the United States from other countries.
Right. They did have still some, as I say, they did have these trades that they would teach them definite manipulative skills. But they didn't have the larger approach that they felt they could be able to attract these, shall I say, imaginative, intelligent, creative people to their industry. Now, merchandising was doing quite well. Merchandising had college courses. The textile industry had college. But the apparel production really was still without its college recognition. So when this committee met, I really still love these quotes that I remember so well, and that I think was the whole philosophy of FIT and it still is. I always remember Morris Half saying, "What our industry needs is a cap and gown." Max Meyer saying, "The apprenticeship system is out. It's no longer sufficient to be a graduate of C&S, coats and suits." Samuel Deist saying, "To attract the youth of our country with these new technical skills, we need college programs." Isidore Nagler from the union saying, the plants,
Excuse me, was his name Nagler?
yes, and the building is named after him across the way there. And Isidore saying, oh, he said, the plants have such difficulty understanding the Army specifications during the war because we lack the trained personnel in engineering that's applied to our industry. So really, the dream of this committee was really to get this college recognition to attract the people to the industry and to be recognized. And this was the spark that set the program going. In 1944, by July, they succeeded in getting a contract with the Board of Education. And the Board of Education promised that it would give 2 floors of the high school building and 10 faculty members. And we were opened in 1944, in September. The foundation would give the materials of instruction, would give scholarships and lecturers, extra services. And we opened with 100 students and 10 teachers. Now, anyone to choose this unknown path, a very new path, by its very nature to choose it, you had a certain spirit of adventure.
Right.
And the faculty had it, and the students had it. And we had a very good representation from the veterans. The foundation gave scholarships of $400 a year. And we really had, I would say, a very exciting group of people.
How many scholarships did the foundation give?
Anyone who was admitted was eligible for the scholarship.
I see.
And in the first years, everybody who was admitted. And I think that went till about 1948, 9. And then we were getting so many admissions that it was. But the original idea was to attract them to this new, unexplored path. And it was really a very exciting time.
Do you recall that 100 students, how many young women, how many young men?
I really,
Approximately.
approximately, I would say that probably there would be 20% would be men. Maybe we had about 20, and the rest were women.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And we
And they were
always
all
had less.
young.
Well, yes, they were all young. Then, of course, we did start an evening division.
When, at the outset, were the students separated into groups of all male, all female?
No.
No, they were always divided up by subject. It was
Right.
coeducational.
There were two major. Right. The questions became, of course, what shall we teach?
Right.
We opened with 2 majors, one in fashion design and one in scientific management.
Mm-hmm.
And these were our 2 curriculums. And then we had to get the balance between how much shall we do in the specialized versus the general, the immediate needs that they might need on the job, and the ultimate paths we thought they may aspire to. And so these balances, as I said in a speech I made, the conferences were just, shall I say, teemed with excited opinions and differences of opinions. But the very fact that we had all these differences of opinions amongst us really led to very great creative thinking amongst us. We utilized the direction of the industry and their opinions, and also of the students. And although our facilities were very limited,
That's when you were still at
oh yeah, we're still in the high school.
with-
We were in the high school till 1959.
Uh-huh.
So our facilities were very limited. But we had the richness of the whole of New York City And the industry was very generous in having us visit their plants, and of course the conventions and the fashion shows. And then of course we had the theaters and the inspirational, because as it was said, it was very good to have techniques in expressing your ideas, but you have to have some ideas to express. So we emphasized the museum, and at that time the costume institutes were divided between Brooklyn and Metropolitan. They had not yet been consolidated, and they were very, very an integral part of our curriculum, right on the programs to go and study at these research centers. And we also had Virginia Pope, who was the dean of the fashion editors, arranged to take them to the opera on Monday night, the Elegant Night, and they would go into the opera club, and there was a table reserved at which they could have coffee, tea, or a soft drink, and meet some of the artists. And what was their assignment? To write what fashion was being shown. The idea was that you have to develop good taste, you must be exposed to it. And they were invited to homes of people. And in other words, the whole attitude was that you were in this world of the arts, and the fashion is a reflection how people live, think, and feel. And in order to get this feeling, architecture, music, literature, it all vibrates of what the society is. And one can almost, just by looking at clothes of the period, tell shall I say, the ideals of that period and what is held up as the thing. And of course in 44, in those 40s, we were still in the age of real elegance.
Indeed.
And it was really a very stimulating, exciting program of integration of all these areas.
The 10 people that you referred to, are you talking now about the total staff or about the teaching staff? You said that you started with 10 professionals and 100 students.
Well, we did have, we had lecturers that would come in, and these were mainly from the industry.
Right.
These
Those
lecturers.
supplemented the teachers.
And they supplemented the
Yeah.
teachers.
So when you talked about your staff, that included Dr. Ritter and yourself, plus the others were, and the
Yes.
others were teachers, right?
Right.
Teaching various
The
subjects.
10 were mainly teaching teachers. There are names here. I have the names of the original 10, but as I said, they were. He was at the first, when we were first
Yes.
founded. He was the director.
Dr. Mortimer Ritter
He
was
was
the
the
director.
right? And I was called the assistant director.
Rosalind
at the
Snyder,
firm,
right.
And then we had the admissions, and she had classes in English. That was Marion Brandress. And fashion art, these Helen Clupton, Dorothy Donnelly. Apparel design, Ernestine Kopp, Nancy Angelier, and Estelle Stern. Millinery, Fanny Silva.
That's
And-
interesting. Millinery.
And
was still being
millinery
taught.
was still there.
Yes, Silvar is Sylvar.
Yes, and management was Bertram Frank, and
Right.
textile science was George Linton, who, and then we had technical consultants that the foundation employed
Right.
on a part-time basis, and they were really educators who were the consultants, Molly Slonim and Nathan Brown. And we really had, I would
Nathan
say,
Brown taught social studies, is that?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
and he
subsequently
later became principal of the high school
I see.
and a superintendent of schools.
And then ultimately he founded or helped to set up Shankar College in Israel.
Yes, he
Right.
did.
Yes, he was the one.
Yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately, he's
Yeah.
not with us any longer.
Yes, I know. Right.
So these, where you see, we had a very good group of people. Most of these people had been, Dr. Ritter had chosen them from the high school, that they had had indicated a certain ability and a certain alertness to this whole problem.
Right.
And it really, as I said, was a group that were very alive to everything going on and to change. Now, of course, during this period, we were very anxious to become a community college. The state had finally set up community colleges. And so they, however, wished to keep our own board of trustees, and because of our whole development and the whole industry being involved. And so finally they had what they called it, Mr. Cooper, our lawyer, called an FIT law, in which the community college was authorized to be set up with the Board of Education. So we were organized in 1951 as a community college, and our curriculum was registered with the state university.
Mm-hmm. And that curriculum, or two-year program?
Now, at that
was like a
time,
certificate.
that was the two-year program, led to the associate degree.
Mhm.
So at least we were a degree granting.
Right.
And of course, now we've gone on. We always knew that eventually we'd go on to the higher degrees as the need allowed. And of course, during this period, we also started to expand our curriculum. Now, the curriculum started to get expanded due to the fact, first, of course, the leadership of the industry was just very active. And when they saw needs, they sort of, for instance, in the buying and merchandising, they felt they wanted more emphasis put on this buying in apparel and all of this, which so they decided to open it to that. Then, of course, there were other areas that in fashion illustration they could see there was a tie-up with that, those who were interested in fashion design. Now, we did have, of course, in the design area, we were emphasizing you have an idea, how are you going to express it? You have the sketch, you have the drape, you have the pattern, and these techniques were part of that. But if you were good in a particular thing, you could specialize.
In other words, you had more than one course in...
and how to express your
Right.
ideas.
Mhm.
And in other words, we wanted to give a person some breadth of availabilities of avenues, and if not that, we also gave a little understanding of the other side of it. For instance, if I were a major in apparel production, I should understand the design, at least in order to know what I'm trying to produce. And the designer should understand the problems in the production room, so that when it's designed, some of these problems can sometimes be avoided if you understand it. So there was an integration. Of course, the faculty, as you see, was small enough to be integrated, and the conferences were, as I say, very close and alert. The community itself was also very helpful. The faculty and students had really vision. They really were. And I would say that they are, their vision, this constant growth and alertness to the needs. And we were not hesitant about changing. If a thing had to be changed, we did it, and we did it together. And it...
so that you had a very flexible attitude towards curriculum.
Everything was very flexible. The evening division started to develop right from as soon as we opened it.
Really? From the
Because
beginning.
there were many adults in the industry who wanted to learn either some of the techniques or some other areas. And it became very popular. Our register went from the 100 to 450 in the day and 1,000 at night. Now, the reason it went to that number, that's all we could accommodate in our space.
Yeah.
And we were certainly crowded to do that. So then the city and state decided that they would build a building, and they did then build the present on 27th Street. Now, it's interesting to note there were other sites available for this building, but finally it was decided that we should stay in the district of the apparel industry. And because this was our laboratory, this was truly our campus. We, instead of having the farmland, we had really apparel industry as the campus. And this, I think, has proven very helpful in both for making it available to people in the industry so they could come and study there and go out and work and the whole work-study deal, and also to have the assets of what's happening. So it's, I think, worked for mutual benefit of the whole community. The achievement of the graduates was also very good. So consequently, we had, as soon as we thought we were going to have a big overcrowded, that we were taking care of so many that 3 times our size, we were going to have 1,200 day students and 3,000 evening when we got to the new building. I understand we got overcrowded immediately, as you can see what happened to more and more buildings.
Yeah, right.
So there was this demand. It was a...
Yeah. How much of it continued to be industry money that went into the growth of the institution?
I would say that the setup. Now, I'm not too cognizant of this, but I know that when we became a community college, 1/3 comes from the city government, the city and state, and I don't know exactly how much, whether it's the city and so forth, and how much the state. 1/3. And, I know now. 1/3 from this, pardon me,
That's all right.
1/3 from the city, 1/3 from the state, and 1/3 from the students. And that 1/3 from the students is sometimes subsidized by scholarships, which is mainly from the industry. Now, the scholarships, of course, the industry, in addition, does give gifts and things of that nature.
Through the foundation.
Through the foundation.
Right.
And sometimes they even give buildings and grants to do certain things. But those are not demanded. I mean, legally, it's supported by city, state, and 1/3 students.
You had... Dean Snyder, let's just review the annual goals of the institution in the early years and the dates at which you achieved various of these goals.
Well, these goals, I would say, led us up to the part when before we became a community college. And we were just then working on this special institute level. And of course, in 44, the main thing was the organization and our objectives. And as I said, our main objective was that we were going to become on a college level, and we were going to act as a college.
Right.
And therefore, there was to be a balance between the general education and the technical education. In 1945, we started the work-study program. One of the major assets, we thought,
How did that work?
were in the senior semester, the student went on the job for a week and came to school for a week, and they were paired, and the industry was very cooperative, and the college.
Were they paid for these weeks?
Yes, they were paid when they worked by the employer, and this was work study. The 1946, we had the first graduating class. And
That must have been thrilling.
was. And everybody, the placement was, I think about this, I really don't know accurately, but I know it was maybe 85%, because the others were going on to other colleges. I mean, it was due to their not being available for placement.
That they were not placed,
But the
otherwise they were
placement was,
placed.
yes. And we also initiated the evening division because we were getting demands from the industry for those already employed who wanted to have more training. In 1947, we introduced the textile design as one of another curriculum.
And that was in response, I assume, to industry or student demand.
Yeah, student demand. And in other words, they had these wonderful textile schools in Philadelphia, and the head of our textile department, Dr. George Minton, was considered an authority in textiles. And he's written many textbooks that we have. And there were many of the textile schools available. However, this was from the standpoint of applying it to apparel, again,
Mhm,
to the
mhm.
manufacturing. And so this was felt to be a need in New York, and also people in the industry wanted to know more about the textile industry. We also introduced the Public Relations Division, and I
Mhm.
believe this is when Shirley Goodman came to our program. Samuel Deach was very influential in trying to interest a broader range of people. And
I say, were you at this point getting students from other places than New York, or was that
right
still...
from the very beginning, we had students from out of town.
Oh, you did?
Now, this was interesting, too, because originally the community college was to just serve the community.
Mhm.
But we never wanted it to be just New York City. We thought that the our community was the fashion industry. And when when our law was passed, it said it was not to be limited to New York City. So it started immediately not being limited. And of course, we also got referrals like sons of manufacturers and people of that kind who were out of town,
Right.
who felt that this was an important path. So when we started, we immediately, in our first class of 100, we had, I remember, 4 people that were not from New York City that had been,
Yes.
but they were, I think, mainly from New York State, the first beginning. But now, as you probably know, they're from all over the world.
Indeed, yes.
Right. And certainly when they went to Israel in that period, we got many from Israel who came
Yes.
over to study and go
Yes.
back.
And now I know there are lots of
Yes,
Europeans,
and
lots of
lots
Orientals.
right. So it really, but from its inception, it was done with the idea that the fashion community is worldwide, and it's over there. So it was always a broad concept.
Yes, right.
Right.
Now, you were saying that it was in
Green.
1947
Yes.
that
And-
the textile division was founded,
Right.
and then...
In 48, we also had certain specialties. Now, these we introduced because we could see where the placement of some of the students were going. And so then you could take a related course in certain areas. Children's wear, shoes, and handbags. Notice, way back in 1948.
Right.
And then in 1949, there was, we looked at our curriculums and decided to weigh them. And the big weighing at that time was to study the placement and weigh what was needed on the first job versus the ultimate job, and try to balance and to have available for people, if they needed a certain technical skill, that you could pick up a course in that skill for your first job, that in order to come on.
Right.
So this was a weighing of that. And in 1950, we introduced the research programs and a one-year program for that you could come into the college if you were a college graduate, because now there were college graduates who wanted this specialized preparation. And so what shall we do with college graduates? So they felt that having a degree or study from FIT might help them placement-wise and with their skills. So we introduced the one-year program. And so in...
The assumption then, I assume, was that the liberal arts part of their training had already been done.
That's
at
right.
The colleges which they attended,
Yes.
and this is now technical.
And very often you got the
fashion-oriented.
liberal arts
Right.
graduate that needed some specialization. And so then in 1951 became the community college, and with the power for the associate degree. Now, of course, now we really wanted to become a recognized part of the college community. So we applied to the Middle States Association for accreditation, and we were accredited by Middle States in 1957. So I would say that, and then in the meantime, our new building was going up, And so we moved into the new building in 1959.
Is that the building which is now
That's
called
Building C.
Building C?
Building C. And we really felt we just had new paths to explore in Building C. And we really felt we had a lot of space. We didn't, we weren't that much of a vision, realizing how much more demand would be evolved and
At
how
that
much
point,
more
there-
technical
Right.
advances were
At that
made.
point, there were no housing facilities, I assume.
We had made arrangements. We had no dormitories, but we did build one dormitory that was going up at that time, which is the Nagla Hall, right across from
right.
the street. But we made arrangements with different housing facilities that were, the Salvation Army had some, and a few of the other, which I was not immediately involved with, but I know they were made to house the students. And we knew we had to expand the dormitory facilities, which were being expanded on the side.
Are you aware of what the union participatory role was during this period?
Well,
or was it just a union representative on the board?
it was I know that they donated money to the foundation. I remember being very excited right at the very beginning, because they were one of the first who gave us $25,000, which we thought was
That's
a
an
fortune.
enormous sum.
We were delighted that the union was coming into this, and that, of course, we got. Now, the exact figures, this I do not have.
Right, yes.
But I do know that we were very pleased, and the fact that a building is now named Dubinsky Building, and we have the Nagla Building, you can see that their part was very positive,
Right.
Because they felt that by building the union, by building this type of program, we would improve the industry, and it would be for everybody's welfare.
Right, yes. Now, let's talk about what happened from 1951 on. 1951 was when you became accredited.
No, in 51 we became a community college.
Community college, right.
Right. And in 1950, that period, the 40s were just getting set, really, and getting sort of be able to stop creeping and walking. And then when we hit the 50s, the 50s were particularly good to us, because it was a period of our becoming recognized, and academically, and also by the whole community, and the whole admissions was.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about where the school hierarchy, how that was working by this time in the early 50s. For example, was Mortimer Ritter still the head of the school?
Well, Mortimer Ritter unfortunately became ill, and he had a heart attack, and it was really a very sad period for us. And this was before 1951. You must realize this is a long time ago,
Oh,
and
indeed, I do.
Maybe a little bit inaccurate, but I know it was before we became a community college, because Mortimer C. Ritter was inaugurated as our first president, and that must have been 51 that he was inaugurated, and he was very ill. Now, Max Meyer, who was the chairman of the board, was it was really practically our acting president during this illness. And Mortimer died, I believe, in 52. I'm not positive, it's right there. And so we were in a period that they were searching for a new president. Now, whom did we want for a new president? Well, we really wanted for this second president, it was felt we would like a president from the academic world, because we wanted a complete feeling of that. And so eventually they had several candidates who applied, and Lawrence L. Bethel was selected as our second president. And he had been a specialist in management, in college. And so Dr. Bethel was brought another area to us, and he really was the one that was in charge during this period of time. I myself retired in '63, and Lawrence Bethel was still there as president.
Right.
So
Now, but getting back to when he became president, what was the administrative staff like?
Well, at this point, he was the president. I, at that point, was called the dean of faculty and administration. I was really his assistant. I still maintained that position. Then, of course, we did have a public relations officer, which was Shirley Goodman.
Right.
And then we had admissions office, which was Marion Grandris that I mentioned. Then we had a placement office, which was Eleanor Freed. I'm talking about the overall admission.
Right.
And then we had chairmen of departments that were gradually becoming their departments.
So that you really had, the administrative staff had grown.
Right.
As the school had grown.
Right. And, but basically...
How many departments were there?
Basically, I still was the overall person of the instructional and the administration team. Now, the number of departments, I really, I'd have to look at one of the old catalogs to know. But basically, the departments, as I remember them, we used to consider it, there was design, and we still had in our mind this design and management. And basically, we would have the design, we'd have the fashion and the textile design. That was our major. And then you came up, then we put in the fashion buying and merchandising.
That was later, in other words.
Well, that was during this. And then, of course, we did have right from the beginning, we had a very wonderful fine arts department. I don't want to leave this out. We had a Dr. Paul Zucker, who was an art historian for the history of civilization, which was a very rich, beautiful program. And the reason I'm emphasizing this art part of the program, the leaders of this, like Max Meyer, was so intense that you cannot have good taste without being exposed to what is, without knowing. And right from its beginning, the arts were just as important as the technical work to develop creativity in this. And as I said enough. I think that in the 50s, as I said, was a very good time for us. We had we had Dr. Bethel became our second president, and the working during this period was, it must have been time of the baby boom. The applicants were very, very, very many, and our only problem was how should we select them?
How did you select them?
And we really had many discussions on how we should do it. Should it only be, we even went in for a little side experiment, which we never really did get too far with. It's not only IQ that makes for a creative person. We felt there must be a certain sensitivity and a certain imaginative approach to things. And we had a little experiment going with some people in the industry that we asked to come in. And I remember that we were trying to see whether we couldn't taste for space relationships or line relationships.
Tests for those
tests, but we never did come up with any real...
But of course, when you have people who are going to be technically trained, they don't really have to be as creative as people who are going to be trained as designers.
But we really did not have our aim, shall I put it this way, we were really teaching the technical for the expression of the creative idea. I would say that our major idea was to have the creators we always felt that the technical you could learn a course just for your technical. We were not mainly on the technical, except if you were already in the industry and you wanted to come back for some technical know-how. But the students that we were selecting, we were hoping would become leaders in the industry on the leadership level. And this was what we were trying to attract. And so if we only had limited space, we were trying to fulfill the dream. And as I said, when I was visiting the Institute, I am very excited that to go back to the Institute today in 1984 and see the same spirit. They're always going someplace.
Yeah, right.
They're always exploring. And we had that, it's still the same.
You bring up an interesting point. You yourself retired in 1963, at which point the school had obviously grown many times since its inception. And from your observation of the students or whatever your observations have been since then, can you talk a little bit about what the student body is like now? And
the question that people say to me is, isn't it different when I visit now? Isn't it different? And my answer wants to be no. It has the same spirit of excitement, of growth. And in fact, I think it retains this spirit of beginning, which I think is totally in harmony with the fashion picture.
Yes, yes.
It has this aliveness to it. Now, true, they have many more students, they have much more space, they have larger physical things, but that is not the important thing to me that they have helped. And it makes me feel that it is still going and reflecting the needs and the directions of the times. And it's not becoming stagnated. I mean, just because something is good, very often when something is good, you never change it. It becomes old.
Right.
But this ability to, and maybe it's because we have so many faculty from the fashion industry, and also the people that want to go into it must have this kind of...
Oh, that does raise another interesting question. What were the qualifications that were required of the faculty members of the school over the years? And I assume that the qualifications changed, too.
Well, I really feel that we really, certainly, as far as the academic were concerned, they generally were leading to the PhD in the academic area. But when you hit your creative levels, at least in maybe things are changing now, but I always remember one of the professors I had in a creative education course in my youth, and he said, you don't get a PhD if you write a novel, if you have a real creative ability. And he said that the tendency was not to, and sometimes the creative person is a little bit rebellious against the organized routine, the stiff routine, and he doesn't get all the right credits in the right places. So when we were selecting people, we also considered what as faculty. We tried to consider, particularly, as I say, in those days, things are changing now because more people have degrees that are coming up. But in the beginning days, a person who became a top designer, it would be very rare that he'd have academic recognition. So we would try to evaluate his record on what his accomplishments were, what his reputation in his field were, and what he had accomplished. And the same was true when we tried to then to select students. We would try to see what creative thing he has done in his life. Now, if you're applying and you're 18 years old, you must have done something. It didn't have to be it could be in music, it could be in literature, it could be in art, it could be in anything. You've done something what have you done?
Right.
And consequently, when they came to be admitted, true, we had the normal test, but we used to ask them to bring their work in from what they had done. And of course, many of them had selected certain things in their high school curriculums to show that they had this, shall I say, direction in their thinking and their feeling. So we did try to weigh the accomplishments and what had been done.
In the evening program, were most of the instructors people who were in the industry in some form or who had been in the industry?
Yes, in the evening programs. Of course, they did have some of the academics. No, but I mean, if they were getting degrees from their evening, we also had some of those. But as far as those in the technical areas, they generally were selected because they were known in the industry as top producers in their areas, and very often they were consultant. Now, when we first started the management area, we had very great trouble getting any instructor who had applied any of the principles of engineering to apparel. So we went to the industry.
Yes, I was going to ask you, what do you include in management?
And they went to the industry and asked we asked them to recommend and some of their employees that might have this ability, because what had happened up to this point, if they had an engineering degree, they would learn the apparel on job. Right. So the industry did lend us some of their instructors to come in, and we, for instance, would employ an engineering major, and then he would work with this person from the industry and see the applications.
Well, what kind of management are you referring to?
Production.
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 Basically production.
Basically production. This was our major deal then.
Right.
I know since then they've gone into many other specialties.
Well, it is interesting, though, to know what was considered management. And so you're talking about a very important area of skill, which is that of the production manager.
We were talking about production, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Not about the whole clerical.
Do you have any feeling about the school when you were not part of it any longer, from '63 on, for example? Do you have any awareness of what happened at the school during all the student unrest of the late '60s? I don't mean the FIT unrest, but the unrest in other schools. Was FIT affected now?
It's interesting is that when they were discussing in this period of recollections that we had the other night, they had one of the faculty members discuss the '60s when there was this period of unrest. And there was very little unrest in FIT. And probably, if you look back in that '60s, most of the unrest was those who were in the liberal arts colleges. If you were in the medical schools or the schools that had a definite, you had made up your mind what you wanted to be, you were not that restless. Now, I think they've had, of course, the teachers were more restless, according to her report, than the faculty.
Who was that who spoke, do you remember?
I think that was, I think it was probably Sylvia Galvin.
Snyder, why don't you tell us about some of the things that really have stayed in your memory about the years when you all were getting started?
Well, when we were all getting started, what really, as I look back upon it, the range of concern that we all had about everything. We were in this together, and we really didn't know quite where we were going. We had to set up these goals. And consequently, our duties were so varied, and we were really working very hard, and we had no concept of hours or time. And I always liked this little incident when I went into a restaurant with a friend of mine, into a cafeteria from the school, and she looked at me and she said, "Exactly what is your duty in this place?" And at that moment, somebody had dropped a tray in the cafeteria, And the manager came over and he nodded to the person back of the counter, and she shook her head no, it wasn't her business. And he looked at the cashier and no, and he looked around and he finally got a mop and mopped it up himself. And I looked at my friend and said, that's my duties. I'm in charge of doing anything that isn't done. But it wasn't just me either. It was anybody on the staff would do what wasn't done. I think we all appreciated that we were interdependent. Mm-hmm. And we all always talked about what the other guy should be doing too. And so we had all these conversations. Sometimes we would get pretty heated, and one of my favorite sentences was that, listen, you're paid for your brains, not your emotions. Leave your emotions out.
Right, yeah.
And, or I would say, let's have more light and less heat. But in the course of this, it was a total devotion and dedication.
Did you have contact with students yourself, or?
I had very little contact with students, except for the committee, when student representatives were called in to give us advice on
when
what to teach.
When did this happen? In other words, you had student panels who helped set up the curriculum?
Well, when we would have it set up, and at the end of the semester, we would call in some of our, particularly our outstanding students, and ask where they felt insecure.
Oh, that's very interesting. You really had student participation.
Yes, from their work study particularly. Where were they insecure? And what would they like a little bit more of to feel security?
That sounds like a great idea. Was it the idea of the student to do this, or?
I would say it was our faculty idea because, as I said, we were, and then we also called in the industry, the employers who were employing these people. What would they like them to have? And only the other day I was in, and a person was taking me around showing me the expansion, and they were showing me how they had this training in that they could pick out materials. They had swatches of all kinds, and they were picking this out. And she said, the industry said they needed this. And I said, oh, yeah, again, how I feel at home, because so many of these things, the whole spirit still remains there. Mm-hmm. And after 40 years, to have this complete spirit still there, I think speaks very well for FIT.
Right. In those early days, how often was the curriculum reviewed or looked at?
I would say every semester.
Every semester.
At the end of the semesters. And we were always expanding all the time. So when things that had become related sometimes went into a major. Mm-hmm. For instance, textile design started out as a related subject. And all of a sudden it became a major.
What do you mean by a related subject?
If I were, say I was majoring in fashion design, but I'm in apparel, but I would take one course in textile design.
And that was called a related.
Related. In other words, it would be related to my activity. It wouldn't be general in that sense.
Right.
But then, all of a sudden, people wanted to get into that.
Yeah. So that a related subject might be an elective, in a sense.
Yes.
And then you're saying that then it could become a core program.
Right, and eventually become a core. Now, when you look at the curriculum today, you see how many majors they have, which had probably all started out in some way of being a related or an elective. And then the more offerings you have, when you start getting all these electives that you have to choose, how much percentage of your program should be required. So this was another big discussion. Required. How much freedom do you permit the student to have? I understand now we did not have that much freedom in the beginning days. The first place, we had no space, and we were sort of blocked in what we were doing. And maybe that's why we had all these conferences about it, because we were really blocking it. But now I believe they have much more individual, because there are more possibilities.
Yes, and there are more individual courses because
and
there
more areas for them to go, more paths for them to travel.
Have you any recollection of the first graduating class, or what the ceremonies might have been? Because this has to have been awfully exciting.
Well, I really have. I just know, of course, we did not wear cap and gown until until 51, and
Right.
and I really haven't got such a. As I say, I just remember that. What I do remember was, it's sort of sad. I remember the the. I really haven't got a clear picture. It was just a pleasant graduation. I really haven't any anecdote that sticks
No,
in my
right.
mind about it.
But those original students, as far as you recall, were placed, perhaps 85% of them, in the industry.
Definitely.
yeah.
As I said, the people who were involved in admissions or placement would know the figures better than I, but I knew it was very good. And I do know that the placement, the achievements of the graduates were very satisfactory, and that led to the whole reputation, because we were. If you came to visit us and you walked into the high school building, it was nothing impressive for you to see.
Right.
I have another little anecdote that I told the other night too, but I think is silly. Talk about being in the high school building. One of our faculty members was showing around an important visitor, and she saw some water on the floor, and she said to this another faculty member came along, and she said, "Will you get someone to mop this up?" And so she left. And when she came back, the faculty member was mopping it, and so she looked at her and said, "I didn't mean you." She said, "Well, you told me to get someone, and I was the only one." In other words, again, we were so close that there was communication. That was really, in many ways, in those anything that's growing. I think in the excitement of being in a small group, you have that advantage. Now, of course, there are disadvantages. When you look at the college today, you have such a much wider breadth, and you have people that are specialties in so many things. You gain in this breadth of vision, but you do lose a certain intimacy. You can't have everything, and you have to balance what you have. And I think on the whole, it's doing good. It did well then, it's doing well now in this balance. And I think it's really great that it's making it.
Well, it certainly is making it. Thank you very much. Dean Snyder, why don't we just have a sort of recap of the things that you were doing, because after all, as the assistant to the head of the school, you had your finger in so many different areas.
Well, I would say that, of course, Dr. Ritter was mainly involved with the Educational Foundation and the Board of Trustees. I mean, he was mainly involved in getting the legislation and the setup and the whole picture of the school. And therefore, delegated to me was the detail of evolving the curriculums and getting them set, and showing, shall I say, and also in sort of setting the teaching methods. Many of our faculty members were coming straight from industry with no educational principles of teaching or methods. And so we were setting up...
Is principally the ones who were going to be teaching in the evening session, or did this apply to the daytime program?
Well, this was, of course, mainly with the evening division, but we had some in the day as we expanded. The original teachers did have some of the teaching experience because they came from the high school, and they had, in order to be eligible for their licenses, they had to have a certain amount of educational courses in the principles of teaching. But some of the others were, and then so many were stimulated to write textbooks. There were no really texts in their area. This was a very lacking thing. You had nothing to go on.
Yes, that is interesting.
And it's really amazing the things that you take for granted when you go into an established program. And here you had a whole new path without text. And you find that so from mopping floors, which I mentioned before, you very often were asked to write a textbook or to put on a fashion show, and when we were putting on the fashion shows, we didn't have money to hire professionals to come in and do it. So we all sort of did it on the
Was putting on fashion shows part of a course, or was this a way of showing
This was
what
the way of
students had
showing.
done?
This was really, I would say, a way of showing the foundation what we were doing, and this was also a motivation for the students to show it was part of the things that happened in industry that you showed your wares.
Right. So you were
so it was
having shows as early as the 40s.
Oh, immediately. We had a fashion show. In fact, the high school had a tradition of fashion shows. So this was no new thing, even though we were now an institute. If they could have a fashion show, certainly we can too.
Yeah, right.
And so we did. And so we started immediately the first semester. And sometimes when I remember being very sad that we didn't have enough equipment, technical equipment, and it was hard to get the money for it. And someone told me the story about that sometimes it's good not to have the technical equipment because then you have to improvise. And when you get a job, it doesn't have all this technical equipment. So this is a stimulation to your thinking. So instead of using it as a handicap, use it as a springboard to think of a solution. So this was another way. And then incidentally, you notice that we did have millinery design to start, because the millinery design, but that we realized that millinery design was gradually, women were not wearing hats. And so eventually that became more of a related program, because there just wasn't the demand in that area, unfortunately, for the millinery industry.
Right. But in terms of your own job, you were involved with curriculum, you were involved with teacher selection, you were involved with teacher training.
Yes.
You were involved with mopping floors. And you were involved with working with a lawyer on various aspects of your problems. So you really had an involvement in a great many different things.
Yes, but I basically, I was not, I would say, that much. I was involved policy-wise in the setting up of admissions and placement, but I was not involved in the implementation of the policy, except if there was a problem. Of course, as I've often said, one of the main questions during this period was, to me, what is our policy? I was responsible for policy. And when this question came, I knew there was no policy, and I had to be cautious how I would answer this question. And I'd always say, now, you know when you're asking me what's our policy, that we have not yet firm. But this is what we'll do in this case. We'll see how it weighs and what we'll do. But I used to have another little favorite saying there was that I may be in doubt, but I'll always give you an answer. So don't feel that the answer is final if it's in a new area, because we have to weigh the conditions.
So that you really, for the first in the first years of the school, in any event, you were really feeling your way, all of you, to
setting policies and how we would set them and what we would do. And I think that should always remain open. I don't think a school or any organization should get so firm in its decisions that it becomes stratified. It can't be changed at all. Right. On the other hand, you have to have some rules and regulations, or you'd have chaos. So you need a balance between the two.
And you need to be able to change from no policy to a policy, or from one policy to another as situations
as the need and the demands require. And that's what I think, again, that I do think the present organization is still doing. I still think it has that spirit. When you're around it, you can feel it. It's constantly going, and it's not afraid to try a new path. of exploration.
Good. Thank you very much.